When we think about how Judaism and Christianity became two distinct religions, it often feels like this really straightforward timeline, doesn't it? Like a clear fork in the road.
Yeah, like a switch was flipped somewhere along the line.
Exactly. But what if those borderlines were actually much, much blurrier, and the whole parting of the ways was more like a long, kind of complex dance, not a sudden break at all?
Oh, absolutely. That conventional understanding can be pretty misleading, honestly. When you really start digging into the sources, the historical texts, the scholarly papers, ancient records, you find a much more nuanced reality. It's actually quite surprising.
And that's exactly what we're doing today. We've got this stack of sources, your research too, and we're launching into a deep dive, trying to unpack this fascinating, sometimes really contentious story.
Right. How these two huge traditions, which were once so deeply intertwined, eventually kind of define themselves, often against each other or sometimes just alongside.
Our mission here is to pull out the most important bits, give you a real shortcut to being well-informed about this absolutely pivotal period in religious history. So let's get into it. Let's unpack this.
Sounds good. Where do we start?
Well, maybe with a foundational question. Scholar Judith M. Liu asks something crucial. Both Judaism and Christianity have kind of eluded our grasp conceptually. When do we even begin to think of them as separate? Is it right back with Jesus, say, cleansing the temple? Or is it much, much later? Maybe the 4th century.
Yeah.
Where you place that starting point seems to change everything.
It really, really does. And Lou points out the definition you land on often hinges entirely on your starting point, your framework.
Right.
And what's really critical and often missed is that she highlights how this separation was significantly stimulated by dramatic changes in who had access to power.
Ah, okay. Power dynamics.
Yeah, which immediately suggests this fluidity of identity in those early centuries, something we don't always fully appreciate, I think.
And that view gets colored too, doesn't it, by this sort of common misconception of a single monolithic Judaism back then. Like there was just one way to be Jewish.
Exactly. That's a huge misconception.
But our sources, they show something totally different. A really vibrant, incredibly diverse landscape, especially during that Second Temple period.
Oh, absolutely. You look at the third quest for the historical Jesus, for instance.
Right, the scholarly movement.
Yeah, trying to understand Jesus strictly within his specific Jewish historical context, it's firmly put Jesus back into that rich, pluralistic Palestinian Jewish culture of his time.
So the conflicts weren't necessarily against Judaism itself.
Precisely. Many conflicts we read about weren't Jesus versus Judaism, but more like intense debates within it. Like different schools of thought arguing. Think of scholars like Jacob Neusner, Geza Vermes, David Flusser, Phineas Lapide. They've really helped us grasp this. It just underlines that the earliest followers of Jesus saw themselves as part of this diverse Jewish world. They weren't outside of it.
That's a really crucial ground point. So speaking of Jesus, let's try and nail down what the sources tell us about his historical actions before all the theological layers got added later. What are the core sort of biographical facts we can hang our hat on?
Okay, well, based on the historical consensus from the sources we have, we know Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist.
Right.
He called disciples. He taught in towns and villages in Galilee, preached about the kingdom of God. He caused some kind of disturbance in the temple area, probably around 30 CE during Passover.
Okay.
Had a final meal with his disciples, was arrested, interrogated by some Jewish authorities, and then executed on the orders of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor.
And his disciples?
They initially fled, but then reported seeing him again. And even, his legal debates, healing on the Sabbath, hand-washing rules, these were entirely internal Jewish discussions.
So within the framework.
Completely. Even if some sayings seem to challenge food laws, they're still operating within that Jewish framework, not trying to create something entirely new from the outside.
It's really striking how internal so much of it was. Then you've got Paul, often painted as this, revolutionary figure who broke from Judaism to basically found Christianity.
A standard picture, yeah.
But he started out as a Pharisee, a devout Jew.
Yeah.
How does his story fit into this fluid period we're talking about?
Right. Paul's story is fascinating here. His birth in Tarsus is pretty well attested, and he himself confirms he was trained as a Pharisee.
Okay.
And his early actions, like approving of and even participating in Stephen's execution,
yeah,
they were so fervent Some scholars basically call him a kind of fundamentalist Pharisaic extremity.
Wow. So very zealous.
Extremely zealous.
Yeah.
Especially disdainful, it seems, of Hellenistic Judaism and non-Jews. But then, here's the critical turn. His mission to accept Gentile converts without requiring circumcision.
The big controversy.
Exactly. That mission was crucially accepted by the Jerusalem leadership, even though there were protests from a more traditionalist Jewish faction within the Jesus movement.
So even that acceptance was negotiated within the group.
Precisely. It just highlights how these early distinctions were being hashed out inside the broader community of Jesus's followers. It wasn't an immediate break.
So the lines were definitely blurry. Did any of these early groups of Jesus followers explicitly still identify as Jewish?
Oh, absolutely. Loads of evidence for that. Take the community behind the Q source, for instance.
That collection of sayings used by Matthew and Luke.
That's the one, that hypothetical source.
Yeah.
The community behind it clearly saw themselves as ethnically Jewish. And interestingly, they seem to have become even more ideologically Jewish over time.
Interesting.
And Matthew's gospel itself, it presents Jesus as the definitive interpreter of Torah, but within the context of first-century Jewish disputes, not as someone starting a whole new religion.
Yeah, okay.
You also see groups like those Justin Martyr describes in his dialogue with Trivo. He gives us valid knowledge of actual existing Jewish Christian communities still engaged in Jewish life.
Right.
And then there's the letter of James, a really powerful early text. It actively avoids terms like Jewish or Christian.
Really?
Yeah. It grounds its whole theological vision squarely in the traditions of Second Temple Israel. It even calls the Torah of freedom. It's a profoundly Jewish document written by followers of Jesus.
That's incredible, that deep intertwining. But obviously things started to shift. Tensions arose.
Yeah.
What were the key moments, the friction points that started pushing these groups apart? I mean, the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, that feels enormous, right?
Oh, immense, catastrophic, really.
Yeah.
The loss of the temple, the physical, spiritual, sacrificial center of Jewish identity, it was a profound crisis for Jews everywhere.
I can only imagine.
It forced this radical rethinking of what it meant to be Jewish. The focus shifted much more towards rabbinic study, synagogue life, but for the emerging Christian church.
Which was becoming more non-Jewish.
Exactly, increasingly dominated by non-Jews.
Right.
For them, this event was often interpreted very differently, as a divine judgment, a sign that the Jewish people's special status, their preeminence, had been, well, canceled, abrogated, because of their collective rejection of Jesus. That interpretation became hugely influential in shaping Christian self-understanding.
Wow. And then there were those internal debates you mentioned earlier within the Jesus movement itself, like that really heated discussion about Gentile circumcision. That must have driven wedges, too.
Absolutely huge. The account in Acts 15 gives a vivid picture. You have these men coming from Judea, teaching that unless Gentiles got circumcised according to Mosaic law, they just couldn't be saved.
That's a hard line.
It led to what the text calls a sharp dispute between Paul and Barnabas. And think about Paul publicly rebuking Peter in Antioch.
Why was that again?
Peter had been eating with Gentile believers, but then he stopped when some men from James, representing the more traditional Jerusalem leadership, showed up. Paul called him out on it.
So it wasn't just about the food rules.
Not really. Paul's argument suggests the core issue was identity. He argued that being in Christ trumped other self-definitions, making things like dietary laws secondary. That was a radical reorientation of belonging.
This whole parting, then, it wasn't just theological debates in isolation. It clearly had deep social, political consequences. Real-world stuff.
Oh, completely. Think about the narratives of the flight to Pella.
Right, where Jewish followers of Jesus supposedly fled during the Roman-Jewish War.
Exactly. Now, the exact timing is debated by scholars, but the historian Josephus does confirm large numbers of Jews fled Jerusalem, seeking refuge with the Romans, and the Jewish Christian community itself. They likely suffered badly at the hands of the Zealots, the Jewish rebels.
So caught in the middle.
Very much so. And remember, even before the war really kicked off, the high priest Ananus ben Annas actually orchestrated the murder of James, Jesus' own brother, and the leader of the Jewish Christian community in Jerusalem back in 62 CE.
Wow, so intense internal friction, too.
Definitely. And external pressures were mounting.
From the Romans, it sounds like they also started to kind of force a distinction between these groups.
Yes. quite forcefully,
Yeah.
especially after 70 CE. Take the Fiscus Judaicus.
The Jewish tax.
Right. Originally, it supported the temple.
Uh-huh.
After the destruction, the Romans repurposed it into this punitive tax levied on all Jews across the empire. And Emperor Domitian, he enforced it really strictly.
How so?
They even went after people who lived as Jews, but maybe didn't publicly identify or who tried to conceal their Jewish origins. This is a pretty clear sign that Roman authorities were actively starting to distinguish between Jews and Christians.
They were drawing lines.
They were drawing lines. And fast forward to the mid-2nd century CE, you see Christians being actively persecuted, martyred by the Romans. While Jews by that point were largely ignored by the authorities in terms of persecution, some people were even converting to Judaism to escape Christian persecution.
That's incredible. Talk about a reversal.
It really highlights how, from an external Roman perspective, the separation was becoming undeniable. It was being imposed.
So as these distinctions are hardening, both internally and externally, we start seeing specific labels emerge. Terms like Ebionites and Nazareans being used to categorize groups that maybe earlier were just seen as followers of Jesus. How did this process of othering, of naming and defining, actually play out?
That process of defining orthodoxy, what counts as correct belief versus heresy, it becomes absolutely central. You see writers like Epiphanius in the 4th century trying to categorize everyone.
Right.
He describes the Ebionites, for instance, as Jewish Christians. Some, he thought, were influenced by Samaritan ideas. They believed Christ came from Joseph's seed, though some apparently held different views later.
And they had specific practices.
Yeah, uniquely, they accepted only Matthew's gospel and only in Hebrew, and they rejected many prophets, similar to the Samaritans. Then you have the Nazarenes. Epiphanius claims they deliberately chose that name to contrast themselves with both Jew and Christian.
So they were actively carving out their own space.
Exactly. It shows communities actively trying to define themselves, creating these distinct intellectual, theological identities, partly through the very act of naming themselves and naming others.
And for the Christians, particularly the sort of emerging mainstream or elite group, those big theological debates, especially wrestling with the nature of God, seem like a huge driver of internal coherence, which then almost by definition creates external boundaries.
Oh, absolutely pivotal. Those 4th century Trinitarian debates, kicking off really with the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, were massive.
Yeah, right.
Nicaea's official letter explicitly stated an aim for a definitive separation from the Jewish people, particularly in its decision about when to celebrate Easter.
Wow, that explicit.
Yes. And these debates, wrestling with Greek philosophical concepts like avousia and hypostasis, basically, the fundamental substance and distinct persons within the Godhead, they fostered this whole new intellectual discipline we call theology.
A new way of thinking.
A new way of thinking, yeah, spread across the Mediterranean. And crucially, this emerging orthodoxy got imperial backing. State power enforced doctrinal uniformity. This really solidified a formalized Christian identity, clearly distinct from Judaism.
So all these Christian elites are busy defining themselves, often against Judaism. What were the rabbinic elites doing around the same time? Were they mirroring this, defining themselves against Christianity?
That's a key point. It wasn't symmetrical, not really. Rabbinic culture, which was deeply rooted in things like Havruta study.
The paired study method.
Right, that social learning model. It was much more focused on internal legal and intellectual development, especially after the temple was gone. Their arguments, their polemics concerning minim, that term they used for various heretics or dissidents.
Right, in the Talmud.
Yeah, in the Babylonian Talmud particularly. Those arguments were often directed against more theoretical opponents or maybe other Jewish groups, rather than being direct, real-world confrontations with Christians all the time.
So less focus on Christians specifically.
In many cases, yes. For instance, there's an account about Rav Safra in Nahardia in Babylonia, which suggests Christians were actually pretty scarce in some of those major Jewish centers. So direct opposition to Christianity just wasn't always a primary driving force for rabbinic identity formation.
Huh. So it really wasn't a symmetrical process of mutual definition then. The Christian side was maybe more actively defining against an other.
Precisely. That seems to be the picture emerging from the sources. While Christian leaders, especially from the 4th century onwards, were very actively defining themselves against an other, and very often that other was Judaism, rabbinic literature, even when it acknowledges Christians, rarely casts them as central figures in their own narratives of otherness.
Interesting.
It strongly suggests that for the rabbis, defining themselves in opposition to Christianity wasn't nearly as fundamental to their identity formation as the reverse was becoming for Christian elites. Their identity was shaped much more by internal debates, the continuity and development of Jewish law, tradition, interpretation, especially in a world without the temple.
Wow. What a journey through these borderlines. It seems so clear now that this parting of the ways wasn't anything like a clean break.
Not at all.
Much more, like you said, a long, really complex dance, with internal arguments, shifting political situations, external pressures from Rome, evolving self-definitions, all shaping these two distinct traditions, which are still somehow forever connected.
Indeed. And I think understanding this whole intricate process, it really reveals just how fluid religious identity can be, how much historical context and power dynamics and the simple act of how people choose to define themselves, how much all that plays a crucial and often really surprising role in shaping the religious landscape we inherit today.
Okay, so here's maybe where it gets really interesting, something for you listening to chew on. If those early followers of Jesus were seen by many for a long time as just another Jewish sect, and if the line between Jew and Christian was so ambiguous, so blurry for centuries, what does that tell you about the sheer power of naming, the power of categorization, how societies draw lines and classify beliefs even when the reality on the ground is far more tangled, far more intertwined and messy? It really makes you think about how we label things, doesn't it? Even now.